Hi, I'm Bob Bostock, and I'm here at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. There's no better place in the country, and indeed in the world, to learn about the remarkable career of America's 37th President, Richard Nixon, than here at the Richard Nixon Library, as well as on the web at nixonfoundation.org and nixonlibrary.gov. Of course, to fully appreciate President Nixon's remarkable years in the arena, it's important to know about the contributions his wife made, Patricia Ryan Nixon, to his success. From his first days in the political arena, they were known as the Patton Dick team. When then Senator Nixon became Vice President of the United States in January of 1953, he and Mrs. Nixon created an entirely new role for the Vice President and the Second Lady of the United States. President Eisenhower counted on the Nixons to represent the United States in countries all across the globe. They brought with them messages of goodwill and support and made quite an impression on more than 50 countries over the course of the 8 years of the Nixon vice presidency. Mrs. Nixon and the Vice President started traveling during his first year as Vice President in 1953 on a tour that took them literally around the world. They were gone for many weeks. They were traveling back then, not with the luxury of current jet aircraft, but on propeller-driven military aircraft with very little staff and only one Secret Service agent. But Mrs. Nixon embraced those trips with great energy and enthusiasm. As a young girl and a young woman, Pat had always hoped to be able to travel and see the world, and her wish to do that was coming true beyond probably her wildest expectations with all the visits that she made. When the Nixons arrived at the different countries, she broke protocol a little bit. Often when a dignitary would arrive in a foreign country, they would be honored with teas and visits to museums and meeting with all the so-called VIPs in that country. But Mrs. Nixon had a different idea. She wanted to meet the people of each country so that they could see that the American people were their friends and their allies. So rather than attend different teas and museum visits, she went out and visited schools and hospitals and orphanages so that she could connect with the people in the countries they were visiting. Her visits were so successful and the impact she made was so significant that she quickly became known as America's ambassador of goodwill. These trips were always very rigorous, but none was so rigorous as a trip to South America in 1958. Communist sympathizers in several of the South American countries were determined to disrupt the visit of the Vice President, Mrs. Nixon. And while there were some incidents in some of the countries, things didn't become really dangerous until they arrived in Caracas, Venezuela. During a motorcade, crowds were able to stop the forward procession of the motorcade and began to attack the cars in which the Vice President and Mrs. Nixon were riding. They hurled stones and bottles at the cars and started to rock the cars in an effort to turn them over. It was really amazing that they weren't killed. Mrs. Nixon, who was driving in a car following the Vice President's car, was accompanied by the wife of the Foreign Minister of Venezuela. The Foreign Minister's wife became very upset, and Mrs. Nixon, as described by Don Hughes, who was accompanying them, he was a military aide, took the wife of the foreign minister into her arms to comfort her and to tell her everything would be all right. Eventually, the cars became freed from the crowds and proceeded to the American embassy. It was a very unnerving experience, to say the least, for the Nixons, but they came through unscathed, and they were respected around the world for their calm under a very, very difficult circumstances. Later, when she became First Lady, Mrs. Nixon became the most traveled First Lady up until that point, and in fact, until Hillary Rodham Clinton surpassed her record more than 20 years later. Mrs. Nixon again visited countries all over the world with the President, but she also made visits on her own, representing the President and the United States to a visit in Liberia in 1972 for the inauguration of their new President. And 2 years later, she traveled to Venezuela representing the United States and the President at the inauguration of that country's new president. So Mrs. Nixon's visits around the world brought an enormous amount of goodwill towards the United States and respect for our country as well. And it was something that she enjoyed doing. She loved people. She loved to get out and meet the people of these different countries. and her childhood dreams of traveling around the world were realized probably far more than she ever could have imagined. So thanks for watching today, and I hope you will tune in for further episodes as we describe the remarkable life and career of Pat Nixon, America's First Lady.